Great. I think we'll give it a minute as everyone filters in, but welcome everyone to tonight's or this morning or this afternoon's webinar, depending on where you might be joining from, on the nuclear umbrella and why the US First Strike Doctrine must go. Really great to be here with you all tonight. My name is Emily Rubino. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Executive Director of Peace Action New York State and a board member of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, which has convened tonight's great webinar. So looking forward to starting in just a moment with all of you, but we're going to give folks another second to join, get their, webinar connections up and running and make sure everyone can hear and see us. We have the chat open right now. We hope that you'll use it to say hello, let us know maybe where you're joining from, but we will get started in just a moment. Great. Okay, I think we might still have folks joining us, but we have all of our panelists here ready to speak with you tonight. And I want to make sure we're respectful of everyone's time. So I'd like to get started. Once again, my name is Emily Rubino. I'm Executive Director of Peace Action New York State and on the board of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. I'll be moderating tonight's webinar on the nuclear umbrella and why the US First Strike Doctrine must go. We have a really incredible international lineup of panelists. Each of them will begin with 8 to 10 minute max. I will be cutting them off at 10 minutes per speaker. And then afterwards we will have Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature in the webinar to submit your questions. And if you have comments or other non-questions you would like to share, please use the chat for that reason. We're going to be getting started in just a moment. First up of our speakers is Ira Hellfand. He's a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, past president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, and co-founder and past president of the Physicians for Social Responsibility. And he's very active with the Back from the Brink campaign. So welcome, Ira, and I'd like you to kick us off. You're muted.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I was talking last week with a local legislator who is a retired military man about the no first use policy and the need to get rid of it. And he had some really interesting comments to make about it. He thinks that we need to maintain a no first use policy, maintain a first use policy. And he based his support for this on his experiences in the military, specifically when he was serving in Afghanistan. And he told me that, there were times when they had what he referred to as actionable intelligence of an imminent Taliban attack. And he felt it was critical that his forces had the ability to preemptively attack the Taliban, not wait for them to attack his men. And in a certain way, this made sense. But the problem is it doesn't scale up to the question of nuclear weapons. We have had actionable intelligence, and the Russians have had actionable intelligence on many occasions during the Cold War. And on those occasions, we actually have also gone down the path of striking first, of launching a first strike, only to realize at the last minute that the actionable intelligence was false intelligence, and to call off the planned first strike at the last moment. If on any of those occasions, the US or Russia had not done that, if they had acted on this intelligence, carried through, and launched a first strike, it is quite probable that none of us would be here tonight to having this conversation. And the fact is that the idea that you can scale considerations from conventional warfare up to nuclear warfare just has this terrible fallacy built into it. The military tends to look at these as sort of military strategy questions. But if you have a different starting point to the conversation, if you begin by looking at what the weapons do, what the actual consequences of a nuclear war would be, you have a very different conversation and you come to a very different conclusion. And so it's my job this evening to sort of set the stage for the policy discussion that will follow by reminding us of what those consequences would be. What would happen if any country with a significant nuclear arsenal decided to launch a first strike? We have in our minds, some of us, clear images of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the destruction that took place there is a very important warning to us of what nuclear weapons can do. But we have to understand that the most important thing about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the destruction that would follow the modern use of nuclear weapons. Because if there is a war between nuclear powers, it will not be one or two relatively small bombs on one or two cities. It will be many bombs on many cities. Each of these bombs anywhere from 10 to 50 times more powerful than the bombs which destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we need to appreciate what this is going to mean. And it's very hard to get our arms around this. You know, if we look out at the world we live in, it's almost impossible to imagine the destruction that we are poised to unleash upon ourselves if we use these weapons. I want to describe to you very briefly what a modern attack on a large city would look like, because it would not look like Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We don't know the exact targeting strategy of either the Russian military or the US military or the Chinese military, but we believe that a major city like New York or Beijing or Moscow would be targeted with anywhere from 10 to 20 nuclear warheads, each of which would be, as I mentioned, in the range of 10 to perhaps as much as 50 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. I try to describe the destruction this would cause by using a model of a single very large nuclear explosion, a 20 megaton explosion, 20 million tons of TNT. The megatonnage, the amount of explosive force, is a little bit bigger than we would see in a modern attack. The destruction is actually less because you cause more damage by setting off many smaller explosions spread out over the area that you wish to destroy. But the model, it gives us an adequate appreciation of what we're talking about. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this weapon, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction. Within this area, the temperature would be hotter than the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour, 1,000 kilometers per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles, 9 kilometers in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles, 25 kilometers in every direction, the heat would still be hot, intense enough that every flammable object would burst into flames. Wood, paper, gasoline, plastic, heating oil, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next 30 minutes would coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles, 50 kilometers across. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 800 degrees centigrade, 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. If this were part of a large-scale war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction would happen in every major city in both countries. And hundreds of millions of people would die in an afternoon. The economic infrastructure of the countries involved would be destroyed so that the survivors would have no public health system, no electric grid, no internet, no fuel distribution system. But that's only part of the story, because in addition to the direct damage that would be caused by this war, the fires started by these explosions would put millions of tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the entire planet, an average of 8 degrees centigrade, 14 degrees Fahrenheit. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures would drop by 25 to 30 degrees centigrade, 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And under these conditions, we would essentially create a nuclear man-made ice age. All of the ecosystems which have evolved in the last 15,000 years since the end of the last naturally occurring ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. Our species might become extinct. This is not the plot of a grade B science fiction movie. This is the danger we are living with every day that we continue to maintain nuclear arsenals. And it's a danger that will be triggered if any one of the nuclear weapon states decides to launch a first strike.
Great. Thank you so much, Ira, for that extremely bleak but grounding and sobering portrayal of what would happen with a modern nuclear attack. I think it's really important that we start our conversations thinking about the human cost, the cost to our environment, before we get into just the policy conversation where it can get very high in the sky. So I think it's really great that you started that off for us, and I really appreciate it. As folks are beginning to hear things, don't forget to write in the Q&A if you have a question, or if you have any comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm very grateful for our next speaker to be joining us all the way from South Korea in the morning. Ayoung Moon is the founder and representative of Peace Momo. She regularly conducts trainings, joins local, regional, and international peace forums for peace activism and education, and she is a fellow member of the International Peace Bureau's Council. So really wonderful to be here with Ayoung, and appreciate you joining us bright and early in the morning.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Ayoung Moon, as Emily just introduced. I'm very happy to join this webinar and listening to Ira's presentation. I was again thinking, about why we are developing such a horrible thing. Why do we need it? But the thing is, when I was asked to prepare this webinar, I was following up the issue, and I'm here to share the general opinion of the Korean society. I'm not representing Korean society in general. I'm not in the position, but I'm trying to share you what I learned through this time. Today, I'm going to share an ongoing controversy in the South Korean society regarding the issue of NFU. And I think this might be different from your expectation. I'm not so sure what you expect from me, but this is, of course, based on my observation and my interpretation. Now in Korea, NFU is not yet a big news to the general public because it is so far confined as a hot issue to those who are related to this field. But the percentage of media coverage on NFU is getting higher at the moment. When the news about NFU became known here, the first response was a question. If NFU is adopted in the US, what would happen to the nuclear umbrella for South Korea? What would happen to us? So here I clearly see the unequal, no flat ground that ROK and US stand on. For the US, NFU is a possible option out of many options. But for its so-called allies, it is not an option. For the people in Korea, it is considered as the question to be or not to be. The so-called security specialists in South Korea, they started to share their opinion, their evaluation on this matter. And according to them, 3 possible NFU scenarios are speculated. I think most of you are understanding this situation similar to them. First, adoption of NFU. Second, adoption of NFU with a designated term, sole purpose. And third, maintaining the status quo, strategic ambiguity. Based on these scenarios, the mainstream responses to NFU among opinion leaders in Korea are very skeptical. The major reasons for this skeptical analysis are like this. First, NFU is going to ruin the nuclear deterrence of the US and put the current international power balance into a disaster. As a result of NFU, the nuclear arms race will escalate, and the US will face an unexpected situation similar to what happened in Afghanistan, as we all witnessed. And second, if NFU is adopted, the possibility of a North Korean attack on South Korea by non-nuclear means might increase, and the security threat that South Korea should face would get severer due to the nuclear umbrella vacuum created by NFU. This is a very strong opinion of the general security specialist in Korea. And for this reason, third, there would be eventually demand and pressure by South Korea to possess its own independent nuclear arsenal. This is not only the perspective from the Korean specialist in security field. These responses are in line with the views of Jennifer Lind and Daryl J. Press. I read their article on the Washington Post. Their evaluation of the current situation was that the once strong alliance between South Korea and the US is weakened by geopolitical forces. Then I asked myself, is this really because of the weakened ties between US-ROK alliance? I have a question to you all. What do you think? What is the motivation of Biden to move forward NFU policy? Do you believe that Biden wants to take the path for global peace by reducing the nuclear weapons or the possibility of using nuclear weapons? I hope that Biden is for that. But from my point of view and from my observation, at least regarding NFU, for me, Biden and Trump are very similar. Both of them want to put America first. NFU is a possible move by the US because it has dominant power. Although the US seems to exercise its power not like before, it is still holding on to its global supremacy and doesn't like to share the supremacy with other actors like China. As a peace activist, and somebody would say that it's ideal approach, but ideally speaking, I would like to say that NFU will be a good move towards nuclear disarmament and alleviation of nuclear tension on the globe. As a peace activist, I welcome NFU policy as it is in a notion of non-proliferation of nuclear. And I do hope NFU to be the positive catalyst for abolition of nuclear weapons in the future. And for the global peace, policies like NFU should be adopted and implemented. However, it is also very important to consider the other aspect that triggers unexpected result, because the US has the power to self-determination, while states like ROK are dependent and treated just as a variable. In the first look, NFU seems to be a rational means to alleviate the nuclear arms race, but it can be also understood as a clever detour to the abolition of a nuclear weapon. Despite all talks of how significant the US-ROK military alliance is or should be, ROK was never an ally in equal terms. As a person, living as I do as a resident of the land being used as a multiple military bases of the US, South Korean people have a reasonable suspicion that the US will not make a decision or choice for ROK's own sake. This awareness will trigger and stimulate. I am quite worried the self-help view that with the adoption of NFU, states like ROK should choose to go nuclear for its own survival. In this sense, NFU itself won't be a great turning point to global peace. To make NFU a decisive momentum to abolish nuclear weapons on the Earth, I believe disarmament of conventional weapons should be discussed together. Without an articulated direction towards disarmament in general, my suspicion that Biden takes NFU as a detour to keep the status quo looks more rational. So what should we do as a member of this planet who wants peace and no war? I think we need to get away from the dichotomy of for or against. I am not for NFU, but not against NFU as well. As a non-US citizen, NFU somehow sounds like a progressive expression of America first. What do you think? Then what is my opinion? I believe we need to take NFU as one of the variables and create multi-track approaches to NFU from a different point of view. NFU needs to be adopted with conditions of disarmament of all the military arms, including wider notion of nuclear armament, including the allies' activities supporting the US nuclear armament as well. Without this condition, NFU can be a bad move that triggers the proliferation of nuclear armament. I will stop here. I'm looking forward to listening from more from you on this matter. I'm not so sure how do you think my presentation about NFU, but I'm looking forward to have more diverse conversation over this topic. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, A-Young, for that. I think extremely important and thoughtful perspective that you've shared with us on the ground in South Korea as someone who is under this US nuclear umbrella. I know even within just the peace movement in the US, there's a lot of debates around a no first use policy. So I think we definitely have a lot to discuss and get into around this. Our next speaker is Yayoi Tsuchida. She's Associate General Secretary of the Japan Council Against A and H Bombs, also called Gensuikyo, and she's a long leading member of the Japanese peace movement and works closely with atomic bomb survivors, organizes international conferences, and represents Gensuikyo internationally. So thank you, Yayoi, for joining us morning your time to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about the movement of Japan that is placed under the US nuclear umbrella. The US government insists that there is no security alternative to nuclear weapons for the foreseeable future. And the Japanese government entrusts the protection of safety and property of the Japanese people to the US nuclear umbrella. But is peace and security of the world protected by nuclear weapons? Faced with existential threats such as the coronavirus pandemic, widening disparity, and collapse of neoliberalism, the climate crisis, and the imminent nuclear threats, and huge waste of military spending, the total prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons is not just a general task, but is the urgent one the peace movement of the world should put into action without delay. In recent years, the US-China hegemonic rivalry over the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait has intensified, which has become a concern in Asia and the world. NATO member states and other US allies are involved in the confrontation, as seen in British dispatch of aircraft carriers and the strengthening of such network to contain China as Quad and AUKUS, as well as going around Japan by the Chinese and Russian warships together. The Japan-US summit meeting in April this year defined their alliance as the foundation of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region and the world as a whole. And the government of Japan, as an equal partner, agreed to promote the military integration with the US. The US promised to give unwavering support for Japan's defense using all kinds of US capabilities, including nuclear, and Japan agreed to strengthen its defense capabilities, including the commitment of the self-defense forces to the Taiwan emergency. It is clear that if the SDF participate in the US military operations, the whole of Japan, not only Okinawa and the Nansei Islands, but Yokosuka and Sasebo, where the US aircraft carriers are deployed, would be dragged into war and suffer from catastrophic devastation. This is the real nature of the nuclear umbrella. The US aimed to integrate Japan's military and make Japan able to fight a war with the US. The protection of Japan by nuclear umbrella is a complete deception. In reality, Japan is put at the forefront of the US nuclear strategy. And to be serious, its reliance on nuclear deterrence is so abnormal that it opposes no first use of the US. Now is the time to break this vicious circle. The current crisis caused by their competition and arms race based on nuclear deterrence, it only increases the risk of war and the use of nuclear weapons. We demand that nuclear weapon states stop hegemonic rivalries and war games conducted in violation of international law, settle disputes by peaceful means, and move to banning and eliminating nuclear weapons based on the UN Charter. As an able country, the Japanese government should ratify the TPNW, break away from the US nuclear umbrella, and take the lead in the elimination of nuclear weapons. It should carry out diplomacy as a country in Asia based on the UN Charter and the Constitution. In this regard, the TPNW has empowered us. The treaty calls on the world to shift from peace and security by nuclear deterrence to peace and security in a world free of nuclear weapons. Therefore, it head-on confronts the nuclear deterrence theory. If the Japanese government joins the treaty, this will bring about a major shift in its nuclear umbrella and security policy, which will also make a significant contribution to peace and security of Japan and Asia. The treaty has also changed the people's thinking. The overwhelming majority of governments and people in the world have come to doubt that it is right for humanity to be constantly in danger of human extinction that may occur at any time. 130 countries have supported the UN resolution on the treaty. In nuclear weapon states and umbrella states, public support for the treaty is high. 59% in the UK, 77% in Belgium, and 89% in Spain. In Japan too, 71% say that the government should join the treaty, and 85% say that it should participate in the first meeting of state parties to the treaty. In Japan, the general election was held last month. 4 opposition parties called for a government change. In their common policy for a new government, they agreed to aim at Japan's accession to the treaty and make effort to participate in the first meeting of state parties. This was a great chance to change the Japan's nuclear and security policy. Unfortunately, the election ended up allowing the Kishida government and its nuclear deterrence policy to continue. But in the electioneering, we called on the people to support the realization of a government joining the TPNW and could lay the groundwork to move Japan into the direction of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Since October last year, we have been conducting a signature campaign to urge the government to sign and ratify the treaty. However, many people in Japan may still believe that the US nuclear umbrella is necessary to protect them from the threats of North Korea and China. We are determined to raise awareness of the people about the danger of a nuclear umbrella and build up an understanding that it is not the answer to ensuring peace and security. We will do our utmost to develop the signature campaign and make known the able damage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to all the people in Japan. Towards the NPT review conference and the first meeting of state parties to the TPNW, let's put the maximum pressure on nuclear weapon states to fulfill the obligation of Article 6 of the NPT and agreements for them to eliminate their nuclear arsenals reached in the past NPT review conferences. At the same time, let's demand that they take the TPNW seriously, ratify it, and achieve the total prohibition of nuclear weapons. We make this demand equally on the US, Russia, China, and North Korea. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Yayoi, for sharing that and for speaking so much about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the general population support. I think it's really important to bring that up as well. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. Our last, but certainly not least speaker this evening is Joseph Gerson, who many of you know is president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, vice president of the International Peace Bureau, and co-founder of the Committee for a Sane US-China Nuclear Policy. He's an authority on the history of the US use of nuclear weapons, and his books include Empire and the Bomb and The Deadly Connection. So lovely to have you speak, Joseph. And just one more time, as Joseph is speaking, we're gonna have a Q&A after this, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Feel free to engage with us in the chat as well. So take it away, Joseph. You're muted.
Of course, the screen share doesn't want to work at the moment. Give me a second. Give me a second here. I am sorry here. It's this PowerPoint. Okay, it took a while, but we're on. First of all, just to appreciate the screen share, I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'm just have to take it like this. Emily, can people see this? Is the slide up? No.
Yes,
Yes, the slides are up. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that, friends. As I begin, I want to frame and place what I'm going to present to you in the context of what Ira was telling us in terms of the consequences of what a nuclear war would be, and to appreciate the kinds of pressures and tensions that a young and Yayoi have to live within. The reality is that at the moment, a nuclear posture review is underway by the Biden administration. This will determine, basically set the guidelines for what nuclear weapons policy of the United States will be for years to come. And at the center of the debate is whether the United States should continue with its first use policy, the policy of preparing and threatening to initiate a nuclear war. This is now more than 75-year-old policy. As we can read in Politico and elsewhere at the moment, On the one hand, we know that President Biden, when he was vice president and during the period he was out of power, had indicated that he could not imagine a circumstance in which the United States would need to initiate nuclear war. But at the same time, we can see that there's great pressure on him from the Pentagon and elsewhere to back off of that. And in fact, Lenore Tamaro, who was leading the posture review and who seemed to be tilted toward significant disarmament steps, was ousted with Biden's approval, apparently under pressure from the military. We also know that the United States, and this is something that I think is not sufficiently understood in this country, the United States has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war on about 30 occasions since the Nagasaki A-bombing. As Dan Ellsberg has been teaching us, and Dan, of course, was the designer of U.S. nuclear war policy, the United States has used it in the same way that an armed robber uses a gun in the midst of an armed robbery, pointing at someone's head. Whether or not the trigger is pulled, the gun has been used. We know, and we should take quite seriously the reality that it was the United States that is the only country to have used nuclear weapons against human populations. And it did so not because it needed to bring the war to an end, which could have been done without the atomic bombing, but it wanted to bring it to an immediate end so the US wouldn't have to share influence in northern China, Manchuria, or Korea with the Soviet Union. Noam Chomsky also tells us that our strategic nuclear weapons have been used in a way to reinforce our wars of intervention around the world, basically to make it clear to any country that might want to come to the aid of the country we are threatening or war against, threatening them with annihilation. And as we could read in W. Bush's initial nuclear weapons policy, the goal is, in terms of deterrence, which we all think of as simply to deter a nuclear attack against the United States. In fact, it's to prevent other countries from taking actions that are inimical to what we describe as our interest. For example, getting our oil under their sand. Here is a list from the Cold War era of the number of times the United States prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war over the Middle East. For me, it was the 1973 November ultimatum. I'm sorry, we have it here. I'm not even seeing it. In 1973, in October, as the October War came to an end, Kissinger placed US forces on nuclear alert in order to warn the Soviets not to intervene on Egypt's behalf when the war was already functionally over. And the reason he did that was to ensure that the war, I'm sorry, we've got Asia here instead of, no wonder I couldn't see it. The reason he did it was to ensure that the outcome of the war was such that US power would be increased, US control of the Middle East would be increased. Here we have the threats related to Asia and the Pacific. It was Eisenhower's threat in 1953 to initiate nuclear war against China and North Korea that provided the model for Nixon in what he called the madman theory, the idea that if the United States threatened nuclear attack, that Vietnam would kowtow to the United States and basically submit to the United States. Put U.S. forces on nuclear alert for about 29 days. Very, very dangerous situation, including having nuclear weapons based in civilian airports like Logan Airport here in Boston. It became so dangerous that the military was urging him to call off the preparations and threat. And we could read in memoirs that it was the fact that 200,000 people had come to Washington to protest the war that convinced Nixon that there was no way he could move forward with it. We wanted to think that the dangers of nuclear war ended with the end of the Cold War. but as you see here, they've been consistent, beginning with the first Gulf War. And we can go into in the Q&A, we can go into details about how these have worked. We tend to think that, let's go over here. We tend to think that our presidents or the prime ministers of other countries have total control over their nuclear arsenals, and that in these circumstances, when nuclear weapons are on their highest alert, that somehow they have control. But we learned that this is not the case during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so when you move to this kind of a attention and DEFCON alert, we face the dangers that Ira was laying out. The power of nationalist forces. Remember that John Kennedy told his brother that if he hadn't moved to confront the Soviet Union the way that he did, he would have been impeached. You have the reality that top military officers don't always follow their orders. That happened during the missile crisis. You have intelligence failures and miscalculations. They didn't understand that the Soviets already had armed nuclear weapons in Cuba. And accidents and miscalculations happened. For example, in that case, sending a launch order for nuclear weapons to U.S. forces in Okinawa, which the commanding officer at least had the sanity to ignore. And we face now increasing confrontations with Russia, with the expansion of NATO, and almost daily confrontations in both the Baltic and Black Seas, where an incident, an accident could lead to an escalation. Similarly, in the South China Sea and around Taiwan, between the United States and China. Simply to say that one small step, and it doesn't eliminate the dangers of nuclear war, would be for the nuclear posture review to conclude with a recommendation, with a new guideline that would move us to a no first use doctrine. China already has one, and this would enable us to proceed, I think, with constructive diplomacy with Chinese leaders, and obviously reduces the dangers of nuclear war. Following this webinar, we'll send out to people additional material so you can take steps to press your members of Congress to in turn press the Biden administration. I think it was primarily Yoy who was making the references to
1 minute warning.
Primarily to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty in its Article 6. I mean, the reality is that the nuclear powers are obligated to be engaged in negotiations for the complete elimination of their nuclear arsenals. Joseph Rotblat was a really quite remarkable figure. He was the one senior scientist in the Manhattan Project that developed the first nuclear weapons to resign in that process over moral considerations. And he's long been no longer with us. He did receive the Nobel Peace Prize before he died. Been very clear that humanity faces really only two options. One is to completely eliminate nuclear weapons, or otherwise we'll see their global proliferation and the wars that will follow, nuclear wars that will follow. Why, he asked? Because no nation will long tolerate what it perceives to be an unjust imbalance of terror. Finally, just to call your attention to two books that will allow you to go deeper into understanding this history and unfortunately the current dangers that we face. Thank you for your attention, and sorry I had to move through this so quickly.
Great, thank you so much for that, Joseph. Just a really wonderful overview, and I appreciate you laying everything out in slides so we could see visually what you were talking about. So I appreciate that. We're now going to move into Q&A. So participants, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If your screen is slightly shrunken, you might have to hit the 3 dots that say more and then click on the Q&A function, but please submit your questions there. Feel free to join the conversation in the chat. I see some raised hands. If your hand is raised, please use the chat or the Q&A function to communicate with us. That will make everything a little bit easier, but we've got all of our wonderful panelists here highlighted, ready to take your questions. And we're going to start it off with a question from Al Carter, who says that he understands that the US is building a smaller tactical weapon. What does that mean? Does anyone want to comment on tactical nuclear weapons in the US arsenal?
Want to take it, Ira?
Perhaps.
Sure. There's an initial thought, well, smaller is better. We don't want big nuclear weapons. The problem is we're developing smaller nuclear weapons, and we believe the Russians and the Chinese are as well, because they're more usable. We're developing them specifically with the intention of being able to use these weapons in the mistaken belief that we can have a little nuclear war, that we can use a small nuclear weapon and not trigger a worldwide nuclear catastrophe. It's an extraordinary gamble, which is not supported by the evidence of what has happened in war games, both during the Cold War and in recent years. Whenever in these games a small nuclear weapon is used, the situation escalates. The side that receives the small nuclear weapon responds with its own, and it goes back and forth until there's a large-scale nuclear war. And so I think we need to view this as a very dangerous development, which threatens to undermine the firewall which has existed since Nagasaki, where no nuclear weapon has been actually exploded. Joseph's point about the fact they've been used many times to threaten is critically important, but no nuclear weapon has been exploded against an enemy target. These small nuclear weapons really threaten to undermine that firewall and lead to nuclear war.
If I could jump in with kind of looking at a couple of the specifics here. The U.S. is now arming missiles on Trident submarines with warheads that can be dialed up or down, targeted against China. And this is in part what's driving the Chinese to increase their arsenal, right? Their fear is that with these weapons, we can launch a first strike attack to essentially wipe out their rather small but nonetheless dangerous nuclear arsenal. So in order to maintain their deterrent arsenal, they're looking to build more nuclear weapons now. Similarly, in Europe, there's really quite a significant movement that's building to try to prevent the deployment of the B-61 nuclear weapons, bombs, which again can be dialed up or down. And as Ira says, the danger here is the two dangers. One is that even a small nuclear weapon will certainly make your day. But beyond that, as Ira was saying, the likelihood of mutual exchanges and escalation is a probability.
Great, thank you both for your insight on that. Our next question is from John Pren, who asks, which adversary of the US would be reassured by a no first use or NFU declaration by the US? Wouldn't they assume if it was an attempt to lull vigilance against a first strike?
I'm going to jump in again here just to say that I've been involved in a number of online discussions with Chinese analysts and physicists and people who are involved in the formulation of Chinese policy. And what they're telling us is, as I was describing before, their fear of a possible United States first strike attack. China has had a no first use policy and doctrine. It's had a comparatively small nuclear arsenal. So I'm sure it doesn't give a lot of a lot of confidence to people in Japan. But in relationship to the United States, it's not one that could launch a preemptive attack against the United States. And what they're telling us is that if the United States would move to a no first use doctrine, it could provide a foundation for building trust and for building diplomacy that could begin to address some of the broader disputes between these two great powers. Could provide a foundation for beginning to explore what détente between the United States and China might look like.
If I could add a comment on that also, I think no first use is one of several steps that the United States needs to take. And it's not just a declaration, but we need to configure our nuclear forces so that we can't carry out a first strike. The Chinese keep their nuclear warheads separate from the missiles that would deliver those weapons, so that it's physically impossible for them to just launch a first strike without taking several days usually to prepare the missiles and launch them. The United States could take steps like that to take our weapons off here, trigger alert, maintaining these weapons ready to be launched in 15 minutes. It's an extraordinarily dangerous posture for our nuclear forces to be in. It increases the danger of an impulsive decision to launch them. It increases the danger that they'll be launched because of a cyber attack. And so the United States should be taking its weapons off here trigger alert as well. And then these initiatives should be broadly cast in terms of a commitment by the United States to redefine its nuclear policy in a fundamental way. Our current policy is based on the notion that nuclear weapons make us safe. They don't. They're the greatest threat to our security. And the United States should publicly acknowledge that and begin the process in consultation with the other 8 nuclear weapon states of eliminating their weapons altogether. And no first use would be a very useful step in its own right, lessening the danger at the current moment, but also a tremendously important confidence building and momentum creating gesture to move forward the whole process of actual nuclear disarmament, which is where we really need to be going.
Great. Thanks, Ira. A younger Yayoi, would you like to weigh in on that?
And no, I was thinking that NFU can be a very important move to redefine, as just Ira said, the nuclear policy of the US, and it will lead other states to redefine their nuclear policy as well, and it will shake some power balance status quo. But at the same time, I'm doubting that trust building by NFU, is it really possible? For me, like maybe I'm too skeptical, but NFU can be another way to keep the dominant power of the US containing China in the status quo at the moment. And I had a discussion with my colleagues, and we had a question. If NFU is adopted with sole purpose together, and if North Korea invaded South Korea, but not South Korean territory, but only the US base in South Korea, then what is going to happen? So for a South Korean perspective, we have like lots of worries and lots of options to consider. So it doesn't really give trust by the action of NFU. And some of the Korean people, we are now like very active to calculate the calculation, what is behind. So I do hope that it can be, I agree with Yayoi's point at the end, like TPNW, and then we need to move forward for abolition of nuclear armament. But the thing is, how can we approach to this situation with the multi-track that it will finally lead to the general disarmament of all the armament, not only the nuclear armament. So that's my point. Thank you for the chance.
Yes, Yayoi.
We don't oppose the no first use. There are groups in Japan which are focusing on preventing Japan from opposing the US adoption of no first use. They are members of the Japan Network for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, of which Gensikyo is also a member. We are working together with them in daily activities. In a meeting with the Foreign Ministry in which I participated, the second agenda was on no first use. We asked Japan not to oppose the US adoption of it, But they say that all nuclear weapon possessing countries should take the policy, no first use altogether. And it should be very favorable, he said. So I want to tell you that without changing Japan's government stance relying on nuclear deterrence, even a step such as the no first use cannot be achieved. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Yayoi. Our next question, I think, is mainly for Ayoung, but maybe others will want to chime in as well. Steve Gallant is asking, US use of nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula would lead to destruction of both Koreas. So threat of first use only works as a bluff. Isn't the bluff too dangerous, possibly threatening the world with nuclear destruction? I think his question is, South Korea being under the US nuclear umbrella, when a US first strike would affect both parts of the Korean Peninsula, does that factor into your thoughts and fears of US nuclear use and of no first use?
Yeah, I think it's very tricky to answer because I'm answering as myself, my own being here. So I'm not representing anybody. But for Korean people, usually we do have like two-minded, how do you say that? Korean people want to have US as a backup, a strong backup for the possible danger in the future. And at the same time, when the peace process on Korean Peninsula was active, then the Korean people, South Korean people, they want to have North Korea on South Korean side so that we can be together as a one nation and build a stronger state together to be able to stand up against the US in the future. So it is very complicated situation. And as just the question was given, like nuclear attack on North Korea or on South Korea, I think it doesn't really matter which side of the Korean Peninsula is being on attack. If once somebody or the US or any other country use nuclear weapon on Korean Peninsula, I think it's gonna be a disaster for all the globe, not only for South and North Korea. So sometimes I feel like, why do we need to spend time to discuss about such a visible result, you know? We shouldn't use nuclear weapon, you know, for any purpose. So for me, like South Korean people, they do not have enough trust for the US. And I'm from Chuncheon, a small city on Korean Peninsula. And in 1987, the US military, they brought strategic nuclear weapon to Chuncheon. And they had a practice, you know, the preemptive nuclear attack on North Korea. And it was hidden to Korean government. It was revealed after like 40 or 50 years later. So I'm not so sure. As an alliance of the US, a citizen of South Korea, I'm asking to myself, do I have a trust about the nuclear umbrella from the ground? That will be my answer.
Great, thank you so much, Ayun, for that very insightful answer. I appreciate your honesty, and it was great to have your cat make an appearance as well. Our next question is from Kathleen Malley Morrison, who's asking if anyone knows if there are any high-level efforts among the leaders of nuclear-powered states to work towards the reduction of nuclear weapons. Some serious facial expressions happening here.
Nothing very promising at the moment. I mean, the United States and the Russian Federation did agree at the summit in June to engage in a strategic dialogue about nuclear weapons issues, which is useful and a step forward from where things were before. There is some suggestion that if President Biden and President Xi have their virtual summit this coming week, a similar arrangement will be proposed, that there at least be a dialogue on these issues. But at the moment, I think the really frightening thing is that all of the major powers, the US, Russia, China, they're all acting as though it is okay to carry on this competition with each other to see who's going to come out on top. And the fact of the matter is that while they're doing this, the world is falling apart in terms of the climate crisis. They're not turning their attention to that. They're not adopting the kind of cooperative stance with regards to each other that they need to deal with the climate crisis and other problems facing the world. And all three of them need a fundamental rethink about what it is they are doing, because if they continue just trying to play the old game and see who's going to come out on top, one of them may indeed end up being on top of things. What they're going to be on top of is the wreckage of our planet. And that kind of insight has not apparently gotten through to the leaders of any of these countries at this point.
The only other thing I would add, I think we need to recognize
I'm sorry to be so bleak, but the situation is really bad.
It is a bleak situation, and I think we need to acknowledge that we're caught in the middle of a number of nuclear arms races. In addition to the U.S. and Russia, U.S. Chinese race, that in turn impacts on the Chinese Indian race, which impacts on the Indian Pakistani race, and it impacts on Chinese relations with the Koreas. And the problem is not only one of reducing the number of nuclear weapons. The Obama administration said, we could go down to 1,000 nuclear weapons deployed from 1,550 without reducing the U.S. deterrent capability. 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons brings on nuclear winter. And we need to understand that, with the integration of AI and other high-tech quote-unquote advances in the development of nuclear weapons, they become ever more deadly. The race goes on quantitatively, if not quantitatively. Moving to a no first use doctrine, followed by which should set the guidelines, the ground rules for what weapons are built, deployed, and retired, should begin to move us back toward a greater sense of trust. But ultimately, we have to go beyond just the reduction of nuclear weapons. We've got to get rid of them.
Thanks, Joseph. This leads pretty smoothly into another question by Gene Stevens, which is, what would be the easiest and best procedure to dismantle all nuclear weapons from the 9 nuke holding nations? So I feel like you've just kind of begun to lay that out, but I'm not sure if any of our other panelists want to comment on what they think best procedure would be to denuclearize.
Well, I think there needs to be negotiation amongst the 9 nuclear states. None of them is likely to sign the TPNW unless there's an agreement with the other 8 states to also take the appropriate actions that they need to get rid of their weapons. And somebody needs to lead that process. In the 1980s, we were dealing more with a bipolar situation in the United States and the Soviet Union. And it wasn't the United States, it was the Soviet Union within the person of Mikhail Gorbachev, who really provided leadership to the process that ended the Cold War arms race and led to the very large reductions in weapons on both sides, but didn't quite complete the job. Today, it's not clear who's going to provide that leadership. For those of us who live in the United States, there's the hope that our administration could do that. It's not at all clear that it is inclined to take that kind of a leadership role on this issue. But if things are going to move forward, someone, probably from the US, Russia, or China, is going to have to play this role, the role that Gorbachev played in the 80s, and initiate a dialogue amongst all the nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement that would bring them all into compliance with the TPNW and enable them all to sign the TPNW and fulfill its obligations.
Great. Thank you, Ira. Would anyone else like to comment on this question about process and procedure for denuclearizing? Young.
You know, sometimes it's very frustrating that international law doesn't have any enforcing power, to make the signatories to act as they signed up. So NPT and TPNW, that now we have very precious treaties like that. But the thing is, how can we really make them work what they need to do? I think it really needs much more peace builders in very different layers and different fields working together. Ira is a doctor, right? You are a doctor?
Yes.
Yeah. So people like Ira, we need more people like Ira in Korea as well. Doctors working for peace and working for denuclearization. But for me, like the trend in Korean society, the peace movement is contained among the peace activists. And it is very difficult to be expanded discourse in general public of Korean society. So I was thinking that how can you reach out and make this issue a hot issue for everybody, not for the peace movement interested people. And at the same time, I was thinking that how can we make the ground equal? When the Korean Peninsula denuclearization discourse is ongoing, US is in a position to request North Korea to be denuclearized, but the denuclearization is not being applied to the US. So I was always wondering why US is in the position to ask North Korea to be denuclearized, but not vice versa. So how can we make this ground to be fair? Without making it fair, I think it will be very difficult to start the negotiation because the superpowers, they keep asking others to denuclearize, but not them. So how can we begin to make this fair? That is my question. Sorry, it's not answer my question again.
So let me jump in here because I'm remembering last month being in a room with Young in Barcelona at the International Peace Bureau World Conference, and we were involved in a online workshop with partners principally in Asia, and a proposal was raised in terms of creating what was termed an Asia-Pacific freeze, in some ways modeled after the nuclear weapons freeze movement here in the United States, in which ultimately, with its partners in Europe and with Gorbachev, led to at least an extended halt in the nuclear arms race and some pretty serious reductions. And so as I was in that workshop and listening to JJ Suh make his presentation, it occurred to me that the idea of moving toward an Asia-Pacific freeze, while not everything we need, can provide a foundation for moving forward in terms of nuclear disarmament in what is, I think, at this point, the most dangerous part of the world. I think certainly work needs to be done on it, but I think it can be put forward in terms of something that people can see as fair. While I'm speaking, I'm also remembering that quite some years ago, I ended up interviewing the man who had written the Japanese military's defense white paper. And to my amazement in that conversation, he said that it was the belief of the Japanese military that they had the right to possess tactical nuclear weapons. And I know there's certainly forces, as Young was saying before, within South Korean society, which are saying that with or without the US nuclear umbrella, South Korea should develop nuclear weapons. My thinking, and I could be wrong here, is that by raising the concept of an Asia-Pacific nuclear freeze, something that people can perceive as fair, can at least potentially provide the foundation for, for pushing the concept of nuclear disarmament to more broadly in society, that could challenge those within, for example, South Korean society, who are saying, well, we should have a nuclear arsenal to confront North Korea's. So I think there are ways that it can be done. I mean, ultimately, I think we're not going to get anywhere without popular force and organization from below. And I think we have to honor and commend the movement in Japan, the strong, powerful popular movement, social movement in Japan, which has made it impossible for people like the man I was interviewing to move forward in terms of developing a nuclear arsenal.
Yes, Yayoi, I'd love to have you weigh in on this.
As other panelists said that we have effective tools such as TPNW and NPT, and now the many governments are putting pressure on nuclear weapon states to take action for prohibition and abolition of nuclear weapons. So we hope that their pressure will be stronger, and the movement is going to work with them. And I think we hope the negotiations between non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states will proceed. But I want to emphasize that another important factor to develop the abolition of nuclear weapons is the people's movement in each country. The Japanese anti-Japanese movement against A and H bombs, has been working for establishing the legal prohibition of nuclear weapons. It took long years, but now that we have the international law to prohibit the nuclear weapons, we are thinking that we discussed what our movement should do in a new stage that nuclear weapons were prohibited. So we decided to focus on the TPNW, the promoting TPNW, the effectiveness of TPNW. So we think we want, we want that we will work together to urge our government to sign and ratify the treaty, the TPNW, and create the maximum pressure towards next year's important occasions for us to urge nuclear weapon states to take action for the prohibition of and elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Yayoi. We certainly have our work cut out for us next year and always, but I think we really need the pressure and power of our movements to push the nuclear armed states to the table, because I don't think they're going to do it voluntarily. I know the US isn't going to voluntarily give up nuclear weapons anytime soon. The next question is from David Barash, and it's kind of what you were pointing to also, Young, but he says, opponents of NFU claim that such a policy would greatly discomfit our NATO allies and could lead to further nuclear proliferation as Holland, Italy, and even possibly Germany obtain their own nukes. Please comment. And I'd like to expand this not just to NATO, but kind of what Tae-young was saying on perhaps South Korea would want to get nuclear weapons. Perhaps people in Japan would push for this as well. So not sure who would like to comment first on this.
Well,
Go ahead, Ira.
I think it depends what perspective people in these countries take. You know, back in the 1980s, when the United States and Soviet Union were really in a standoff over Europe, the US was pretty clear we would use nuclear weapons first. Had that happened, the NATO countries all would have been destroyed. It would have been Europe that would have been in ashes initially, probably the whole world soon after. But so if people look at this question as if they're playing chess, there may be an inclination for them to say, well, if the US isn't going to use nuclear weapons first, we need to have ours so we can use them first. If we ground the conversation in the medical consequences, the humanitarian impact, what these weapons are actually going to do, I don't think you're going to have people pushing to have their own nuclear forces. Why in the world would people in Germany or Japan or any of the other countries in NATO or under the umbrella in East Asia want to have nuclear weapons, the use of which will destroy their own country? And so I think that it's critically important that we try as best we can to frame this conversation in this way. That's what led to such progress in negotiating the TPNW. When we framed the conversation using the Red Cross's term, that we were focusing on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, not nuclear strategy games, but the real world consequences of using these weapons. It changed everything. And that's what we need to keep doing. We need to keep refocusing this discussion on what's going to happen if we use these weapons. People in Korea who were concerned that a no first use policy might lead to increased aggressiveness from North Korea. Legitimate concern. What's going to happen if the United States uses nuclear weapons first? A much greater concern, I would think. So I think that's the key to this. We just need to keep the focus on the real world, what is going to happen if the weapons are used, not on the strategy games that the military play in their think tanks.
Thank you, Ira. Joseph, did you want to jump in next on this?
No, I mean, I think Ira said it well. I mean, one of my frustrations about the size of the planet is that ideally I would have liked to have had some of our European partners as part of this conversation, but it's well past midnight there, so perhaps we'll have other opportunities. But simply to say that there are very strong and important peace movements in Europe who certainly understand, and you have the reality. I think it was maybe Yayoi who was running down the numbers in a number of countries in Western Europe who are supporting the TPNW. Those are strong social forces, and I think one of the, as I've thought about the TPNW and tried to find ways of supporting it, one of the things that's been clear to me is that if one or more of the umbrella states will break from the discipline and sign on to the TPNW, that carries the possibility of unraveling the threads of the fabric of the whole structure of preparations for nuclear Armageddon. And we do have, Norway has now, a NATO member, has now said it's going to send an observer to observer delegation to the first meeting of TPNW. It's being debated in Germany and in several other countries. So these are important debates and important ways of moving it forward. The other thought that occurs to me is that as we're talking, the idea is that the only way a country can preserve its independence, its security, is through having nuclear weapons or the nuclear umbrella. But the reality is the technologies are, there's lots of ways to resist, right? With national defense, nonviolent resistance, the realities of cyber warfare, which could have disastrous results on its own. There are numerous ways in which peoples and states can resist aggression. Just look at the number of times the United States has lost wars despite having its nuclear arsenal.
Ayeon, did you want to jump in on this?
I was thinking, as just Ira mentioned about we need to share the real reality to the people, the consequences of nuclear weapon, the humanitarian, damage. But I was thinking that as a person grown up in a divided country, the public education, they very explicitly pour the information about North Korean people as an enemy. And once they are demonized, the humanitarian approaches don't work. So I was thinking that how can we overcome this dichotomy between us and them and us and enemy? If we consider someone as an enemy, then I think that some of the Korean people, they still want stronger status including nuclear weapons. So that was, I was like questioning to myself, how can you overcome this dichotomy and how can we make people to see what will be really happening if this keep going.
And you raise a very important point, but and it certainly can be difficult in a situation of conflict. But I would point to the experience that we all had in the 1980s when the United States and the Soviet Union were terribly bitter enemies, enormous hostility and suspicion. But people on both sides were able to understand ultimately that a nuclear war between the two countries was the worst thing that could possibly happen. And that none of the differences between our two countries were worth fighting over in a way that would destroy the entire planet. And I think the current situation is difficult, but we can reproduce that phenomenon where we were able to educate people about what was going to happen, and they drew the correct conclusion that it was not worth going ahead with this rivalry when the consequences were going to be mutual annihilation. I don't believe that the people in North or South Korea want to see the Korean Peninsula incinerated. And if they understand that that's what is going to happen if there's a nuclear war, they're going to want to take, I think, the steps that need to be taken to lessen the danger of nuclear war. It's a tough situation, there's no question about that. But it's not an impossible situation.
I agree with you. I'm a peace educator in Korea, and I'm working for that. But at the same time, the U.S. and Soviet Union, the negotiation was possible because they had a, experience. They witnessed what happened with Japanese people. So we are standing on a different ground, and the feeling, the anxiety is different. And how can you really touch people's mind and the anxiety that they have, so that we don't need to face or perceive each other as an enemy, but we can build another future together. So I was thinking that how can you reach that point, And sometimes, yes, Joseph, please.
Only to say that it's also possible to remain enemies, to remain rivals, but to draw a line and say we're not going to annihilate ourselves. And I think that's one of the places and I think there are ways. I mean, one of the things that was done back in the 80s, and Ira's organization, Physicians for Social Responsibility, was deeply involved, was producing books and other resources that showed what would happen if there was a nuclear attack on your city. In my town, Cambridge, Massachusetts, the city council paid for the printing of a booklet that went to every home in the community that had maps and graphics and basic information about what would happen if there was a nuclear attack on Boston or in Cambridge. And that helped to build the movement that led to referendum here in terms of whether the city should be nuclear free. There are I think numerous ways. I mean, part of it, and I've been in demonstrations in South Korea and experienced what the police will do in response to a public demonstration. So I know it's not always easy, but going out into the streets, going out in ways, going in meetings and in communities, taking risks is just very, very important. I mean, you have to break the mold. It's not easy to break the mold. It can be frightening to break the mold, but that's the only way the mold gets broken. I just want to jump in real quickly because I had seen one question, which was, do the nuclear threats work? And just very quickly to say, sometimes they have and sometimes they haven't. The first one, post-Nagasaki in 1946, Truman, when Russia, the Soviet Union didn't have nuclear weapons and was slow in getting out of Iran, which it had occupied during the Second World War with US approval for basically a way to supply the Soviet Union during the war against Hitler. Truman called in the Soviet ambassador to the White House and said, if you don't begin with a withdrawal within 48 hours, we're going to eliminate Moscow. That withdrawal began in 24 hours. In 1991, in the buildup to the first Gulf War, the US and the Brits were afraid that as US forces were building to prepare to go into Kuwait, that Saddam Hussein might use chemical weapons to basically to destroy those gathering forces. The nuclear threat was made. It happened again during W. Bush's war, and we don't know if it worked or not. But that those preemptive attacks against U.S. forces didn't happen. On the other hand, there were a number of occasions in where the threats were made, particularly in relationship to Vietnam, where they had no ultimate influence. So sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But the real danger is when leaders believe that they might. And as I laid out before, when you have that build up, the moving to the DEFCON higher alerts, there is the danger, the greater danger of an accident or a miscalculation. The belief that a flock of geese are in fact an incoming weapon. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, and the answer, of course, is to get rid of the things.
Great, thanks, Joseph. I'm taking a look at the time and realizing it's almost 8:30. I'd like us to wrap up with kind of one more question. I'm going to be paraphrasing from Steve Leeper, but his point is basically that, everyone knows the countries that have nuclear weapons. You could walk out on the street and people know that North Korea is developing nuclear weapons, but they may have never heard of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons or heard of these other kind of abolitionist efforts. So how can we, as activists, as abolitionists, have meaningful, powerful have an effect on global public consciousness? How can we work towards that? I know it's a very loaded question, but perhaps if everyone could have a chance to answer briefly, so that, and just kind of make those your closing remarks as well. I think that would be a great way for us to end. Maybe we can go in the order that everyone spoke originally. So Ira, if you'd like to start with that.
I think the key to this is public education. We've all identified that people do not have an adequate understanding of the nuclear situation that we're in. And that's our responsibility to try to change that. And how we do that is obviously it's a difficult task. Figuring out how to do it is going to be the key question. I've been somewhat bleak in some of my musings tonight. It is a very bad situation that we're living in at the moment. But fundamentally, I'm not pessimistic about this. There's no reason in the world why we cannot and should not get rid of our nuclear weapons. This is not a huge problem like climate change that requires everyone to change all kinds of things about the way they live. This is a simple political decision that can be taken, and it really is something that we ought to be able to do. And I think with enough public education, we'll create the pressure that we will do it.
Great, thank you so much, Ira. Ayun?
Thank you for the opportunity tonight and this morning or afternoon. I think I shared my point of view, which can be viewed by you as a pessimistic approaches, but I'm an optimistic person, and I agree with Ira. We need more opportunities to create information about what is really happening. And we need to create a chances that people can be exposed, discourse of peace. And I was thinking that how can we make more channels? That is my concern always. So I'm not so sure. I don't have the answer. We don't have the answer at the moment, but we will create our own way. And we will see in the future that, as you said, that it's a simple political decision, not the climate issues, you know? So not like the climate issue. So I got an insight through this webinar, and I do my part, and I will update you later what I have done in the future. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Ayoung, and thanks for raising so many important questions. I know I and many others will be continuing to muse after tonight. Yoyoy, I'd love for you to go next.
In order to promote the effectiveness of TPNW, we think the focus is to make known to the people the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And in Japan, we have the A-bomb experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there are Hibakusha's testimony and Hibakusha's effort. So we need to continue to let the people know about the atomic bombing aim of damage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in Japan, the public support for the TPNW is high, but actually they don't know much about the treaty and what it means for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So every time North Korea conducts missile tests, you know, there are threats from North Korea and threats from China are reported on TV like every day. So we think we need to continue this effort to promote the effectiveness of TPNW, and we think it's important to work together internationally to achieve the total prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
So
Yoyoy,
I'm going to come from two different directions. First, to say that I've been extremely fortunate over the years to work closely with the Hibakusha A-bomb survivors in Japan and with the Japanese peace movement. And you know, one of the things that has impressed me and I've attempted to internalize is a sense of really focusing on what's most important and holding to that, developing a will. I mean, I think if everybody who is listening in this session, or who hears it later on when the recording is available, lived as if the danger that Ira so eloquently described is as imminent as it is, and then thought about those you love and the danger that we face, you would take action. You would use your imagination to think about different things that you can do. One very small thing is everybody who's listening to this can contact their members of Congress to urge them to press Biden on no first use and to cut spending, to move not only to no first use doctrine, but to get rid of the land-based nuclear weapons, which there is a debate going on about them, or the standoff missiles that are being developed. The other approach is I think to think that we are already having impact. If you read the press here in the United States, you'll see that Republicans and the Pentagon are very frightened that Biden might actually adopt a no first use doctrine. This is the result of work that people have been doing now over decades. We need to continue to give it a push. Similarly, there are the debates that are going on in Europe. The possibility of one of the NATO members refusing to click heels and actually pull on the threads of the nuclear fabric. And when they're pulled, the unexpected can happen. Nobody expected Gorbachev to emerge as he did. Changes happen. And you have to just continue to push and push and push as imaginatively and as creatively as we can. The alternative is not to do it. And we know what the consequences of that alternative would be.
Great. Thank you so much, Joseph. I think that's a great note to end on, is getting everyone's imagination going, getting everyone's creative juices flowing. And if anyone has the answer, please let us know. But in the meantime, we'll keep trying out different tactics and seeing what works. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining tonight. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, evening, afternoon, whatever it may be. And a special thanks to Ira, Ayoung, Yoyoy, and Joseph for joining us tonight. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Bye-bye.